Good evening. This is Pastor J. Wendell Mapson Jr., and I welcome Monumental and Friends of Monumental uh, on this evening of Bible study. Who would have thought, as recently as a couple of days ago, that we would be using this format for Bible study at this particular time? And of course, it has been made necessary by the coronavirus, which is a pandemic, of course, and we are doing everything in terms of following the uh, instructions and guidelines of our health officials and government to see to it that we are as safe as possible as a congregation, and that we reduce the spread of the germ as much as possible. I think that when we look at the condition of our world, and particularly with this pandemic, we have to continue to ask the question of where's God in this, and what is God trying to say to us and to the nation? And we continue to believe and trust Him. As people of God, we want to use common sense, but at the same time, we trust a God who is our creator, and we do not lose hope as the world may lose hope, and we do not panic as the world panics, but we put our trust in Him, for He is the real source of our safety and our protection. I want to just mention a few protocols that have been put in place as we again seek to follow the guidelines of our government, which now is suggesting that not more than 10 persons at a time gather in one place. We have suspended our worship service, of course, at least for the next 2 weeks, and only because we want to reevaluate the situation at least every 2 weeks. But probably it will be a lot longer than that. There will be no church activities and events during this particular time. Um, we Our concern, of course, would be funerals, and we are working and will continue to work with families and morticians to see the best way to go forward. Um, the funeral for Friday has been canceled. Family has instead decided to have just viewing at the funeral home, which is Dupree Funeral Home, and hopefully members of our church who who find it comfortable enough to do so will at least go by and greet the family from a distance, so that Monumental is represented at that particular time. And the funeral of Brother Glenwood Bond is going to be held next Monday at the Francis Funeral Home, and same type protocols are in place there. I think that the question for us is, how can we continue to be the church during this crisis? Businesses close, and other venues close. Um, the church is more than a building, the building in which it is housed. It is the people of God, and we want to be open to creative and innovative ways to continue to be God's people, uh, with some form of worship and Bible study at least. And so I want to thank Jesse Mapson for putting into place and continuing to work on ways that we can remain connected through the crisis, uh, so that even though we are not together physically and geographically, we are connected nonetheless. We will follow the protocols in terms of Sunday morning worship with no more than 10 persons. I will be asking certain persons I feel are vital and necessary for worship to be present. I will be in the pulpit. I will be preaching. We will have an abbreviated service, but we certainly recommend that you live stream and that you pass the word around for others to do the same. Real purpose tonight is Bible study. We have been talking and studying for several weeks about love, and I want to just give an overview of what we have been discussing and talking about thus far, especially for the benefit of those who are joining us for Bible study have not joined us for some time or just joining us for the first time. We've been studying the first letter of the Apostle Paul written to the church at Corinth. Let me remind us as we enter into this study that 1 Corinthians is labeled an epistle or letter. And when we study the Bible, when we study the books in the Bible, and there are 66 of them, we have to know what type of literature we are studying. Are we studying history? Are we studying poetry? Are we studying gospels? Are we studying prophecy? Because the type of literature we're studying determines how that literature is studied. So when we talk about an epistle, for instance, or a letter, we have to ask questions such as, what are the characteristics of an epistle or a letter? Think about letters you may have written, certainly at a time in the past, perhaps when letter writing was more prominent and important as communication. The letter, there's a salutation in a letter. The letter, there's the body of the letter, the content of the letter. There's a greeting. There is a closing. A letter closes a certain way. A letter lets the writer, the recipient, know who the letter is coming from. And so when we look at 1 Corinthians, we identify it as a letter. And a letter is written for a purpose. When you write, you're writing to communicate with a friend or loved one, or maybe a business matter, what's going on. You're responding to an issue that they raised. You're imparting information. And so when we study the letters of Paul, we ask the question, well, why was the letter written in the first place? And letters were written for two reasons. Because Paul, number one, because Paul had heard of issues that had come up in the congregation at Corinth, a new church that he did not found, but a new church, new Christians who are seeking to understand, now that we are in Christ, now that we belong to Christ, how do we live as new Christians in a pagan world? So they were raising questions about what kind of foods should we eat? How do we understand the Lord's Supper? How do we understand public worship? And so Paul addresses these issues and concerns in his letter. The second reason he writes is because he's unable to be with them in person. Spent a lot of time in prison, as you might well know, or traveling, or engaged in other ministry activities. And so he writes because he's unable to be with them in person. The letter is delivered by one of Paul's trusted associates, and the letter is read to the congregation, which probably met in a home of one of the believers. And so it's rather ironic that here we are. I'm not behind the pulpit as I speak, or at the church at all, but in my home, in our home. Um, Early Christians didn't have the luxuries of, uh, of sanctuaries, buildings, stained glass windows, and instruments and pews and carpeted floors. They worship from house to house. And so this letter, no doubt, was read to the congregation in someone's house. And in the letter, Paul is answering some of their concerns. Now, which brings us to the topic that has been under our consideration for several weeks now, which is love. We talk about love. We've talked about the different forms of love, the different kinds of love, and our understanding that it is agape love. It is love of God and God's love of us that informs uh, and defines all other types of love. And so the issue here in the Church of Corinth is that the issue is spiritual gifts. People uh, had they were in possession of different gifts of the Spirit, and it had become a kind of a competition. People in the church were bragging about the gift they had, and the superiority of that gift over another gift. And when we start talking about the superiority of gifts, we're talking about the superiority of the people who had the gift. And so there are people who thought that they were better than others because they had particular gifts. And so he writes First Corinthians, and particularly this 13th chapter, as a response to that. And he's saying that it does not matter what kind of gift one has or what value one places on that gift. If one does not have love, this agape love, then the gift is meaningless. And so to understand First Corinthians chapter 13, we've discovered that we have to first understand and read chapter 12, and then further ahead, chapter 14, and put in context what Paul is saying to these new Christians. Chapter 12 is about spiritual gifts. Chapter 14 is about spiritual gifts. And he moves seamlessly into chapter 13 by ending chapter 12 by saying, now I show you the most excellent way. And so he's saying, uh, uh, all of these gifts are wonderful. He says, I speak in tongues as well. They're to be valued, particularly the gift of prophecy, but without love, it means nothing. And so he begins chapter 13 by saying basically two things, or at least two things. He's saying, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels and have not love. So he's saying that you can speak in tongues all you want to. If you don't have love, it means nothing. You can have the gift of prophecy and have not love, and it means nothing. Four things, actually. You can be a worker of miracles, uh, move mountains and all of that. But if you do not have love, it means nothing. And you can, when he's talking about giving your body to be burned or surrendering your body to the flames, he's talking about martyrdom. People who set their bodies on fire and become martyrs to draw attention to their devotion and their faith, and perhaps influence others to do the same. Four things: I can speak in tongues, I can prophesy, I can perform miracles, and I can give my body to be burned as a martyr. But if I do not have love, he uses the language, I gain nothing. I'm nothing but a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. I am nothing, he says, if I don't have love. And so as we move through 1 Corinthians chapter 13, there are four things that love is in this lesson. Love in verse 4 is patient and kind, two things. The other two come later on, but he begins by saying love is two things. Love is patient and love is kind. It seems to me that the relevance of of this lesson in terms of agape love, um, I think we're being reminded through this coronavirus pandemic of the importance of being patient and being kind. I mean, I think it's ironic that here we are in the midst of this crisis, and here we are tonight uh, talking about love, uh, and really having to ask the question, um, what does it mean to have patience in a crisis? Um, what does it mean to avoid panic? What does it mean to be a calming influence not only to ourselves but to our children? You know, how do we address our children in terms of being calm, but also in terms of just patience? That this is a difficult season, but there's um, there's no quick solutions here. This is going to be with us for a while, and so how do we how do we develop patience in a situation like this, and kindness? How do we show kindness and not suspicion, and not um, um, being unkind to one another, but just showing a sense of kindness to one another. So those are the two things he says that love is. Love is first of all patient, and love is kind. What would the world be like, and our families, and what would we be like if we could show more kindness and more patience with ourselves and also one with the other? Then Paul goes into what love is not, or what love does not do. And there are 8 things that he says love is not, or that love does not do. Love does not envy. Love is not envious. We ought not be envious of what others have, um, uh, because just because we don't have what others have. We ought not be boastful. Love does not boast. I'm better than you are. And in this context, it is Paul who is saying to these Christians in Corinth, stop boasting just because you have a certain gift. That is nothing to boast about, because a gift is given, meaning that it's not about you, the receiver, it's about the giver. The God is the one who gives us the gifts, not because we deserve those gifts or we've earned those gifts, um, but simply because he wants to have us to have them, and not for ourselves. I've said many times that uh, God does not bless us for us to keep the blessing. He blesses us so that we will be a blessing to others. Um, and so we're not to boast about those gifts. He says, love is not proud, or another translation uses the term puffed up. You know, people who are uh, who just overly proud and puffed up. Love is not rude. Love is not self-seeking. So we're not seeking just what is in our own best interest. I've seen it many times, even politically, where a person votes for a candidate based on the fact that that person has prospered under that particular candidate, not concerned about the rest of us and other people, not concerned about, because the economy has been good to you doesn't mean the economy has been good to everybody. And so there are poor people, there are people who are suffering, there are minorities who are suffering, uh, there are children who are suffering, there's mass incarceration, and we have to support candidates with policies that address our communities and not just our own self-interest. Love is not self-seeking. Love is not easily angered. Um, there are times we get angry, but then there's a difference between being slow to anger, and there's some people who just seem to snap at anything. He does not say just is not angered at all. He says not easily angered. There sometimes anger is justified uh, in terms of what we're angry about, but not easily angered, not easily uh, uh, just losing it. And we see it every day. There are people who just seem just angry about everything. Uh, and it shows up in the way their behavior, the way they talk to you. He says, love does not keep a record of wrongs. So love does not, you don't sit down with a notebook and write down the wrongs that people have done to you. And sometimes when we do that, we save the ledger to use at a later time. So 5 years from now or next month, I'm going to read a list of things that have been on my ledger for a long time. That's not the way love operates. And then he says, love does not delight in evil. Um, but the contrast to that is that love rejoices in the truth, not in things, not in evil people, or not the evil things that people do, but rejoices in the truth. And then he ends rather this section with the final two things that love is. He says, love trusts. Three things rather: love trusts, hopes, and perseveres. Love always protects, love always trusts, love always hopes. The four things, and love always perseveres. I'm going to stop now and and again express my appreciation for these moments that we have shared together. God bless you.